Long before kingdoms rose and borders hardened, people shaped the world with quiet footsteps. Trails formed where hunters walked, where water flowed, and where families returned season after season. These faint lines in soil slowly became lifelines, carrying stories, food, tools, and hopes between distant places. Across forests, deserts, rivers, and mountains, unseen roads linked strangers long before anyone knew their names. This is the forgotten journey of how simple paths guided the growth of villages, cultures, and civilizations across the earth. The first roads humans used were not designed in any planned way. They appeared where bare feet passed often enough to leave a shallow line in the soil. A hunter returning from the grasslands followed the same track each time, carrying meat back toward a familiar shelter. Families walking down to a river widened the strip of earth with every visit. These early trails came from simple necessity and repeated memory. Archaeologists call them desire paths because they form naturally, without maps, rulers, or leaders agreeing on a direction. In East Africa, subtle soil changes buried under later layers tell researchers where repeated footsteps once shaped the land. The idea of a road started long before stone, brick, or carved paving entered human history. Movement itself was survival. Groups followed grazing herds across open plains and shifted camp when rains failed or predators grew bold. Certain paths became trusted because they always led to safety or water. Children memorized the way by walking behind elders who pointed out shapes and sounds. A bent tree that leaned over a bend in the trail, a rock split by lightning, or a rise where wind always whistled. These landmarks served as natural guides long before signs existed. Knowledge passed from voice to voice, forming a living map carried inside the mind. Over thousands of journeys, these trails deepened. One path linked two seasonal camps, then another joined a lakeshore deep in the interior. People meeting by chance on the same route traded more than objects. They traded ideas about weather, plants, and distant lands. Shell beads and stone tools found far from their origin prove how far early footsteps traveled. Today, scattered tools and flakes left beside these old paths mark where someone paused to rest, sharpen a blade, or share news. Piece by piece, the first lines of a global web took shape, built not with tools but with time and need. As humans settled more often and stayed longer in familiar places, movement changed from wandering to returning. Camps grew into small villages, and the same footpaths connected houses, gardens, and storage pits. Along riverbanks in East Africa and the Near East, people began carrying stones and clay to anchor the soil beneath their feet. Each load packed the trail tighter until rain could no longer wash it away in a single storm. The difference between a path and a road slowly emerged, not through planning but through effort repeated year after year. Travelers felt the ground firm beneath them and understood that these routes mattered. They were becoming shared spaces rather than simple tracks etched by chance. Archaeologists digging near early farming sites often find worn stones at the edges of old walkways, rounded by centuries of passing steps. These fragments show how small communities tried to keep their roots usable as populations grew. Movement no longer belonged only to hunters or scouts. Farmers hauled baskets of grain toward neighbors. Potters carried bowls and jars to open markets where families bartered spices, tools, and skins. Trails that once led solely to water now linked homes to fields, pastures, and granaries. The rising need for exchange hardened the network further. Some of the earliest planned roads appear near ancient rivers where settlement was dense. In places along the Nile, evidence of packed earth routes runs parallel to the water, connecting clusters of huts and work areas. Though far simpler than the paved avenues that would come later, these were built with intention. People filled holes, leveled bumps, and widened corners to allow sleds or baskets pulled on wooden frames to pass. Early roads acted like threads, sewing communities into something larger. They shaped where families lived, how far crops could be traded, and how quickly news spread. With every step, the idea of connection became more powerful than any single destination. The idea of connection expanded as people learned to shape landscapes deliberately. In parts of the Middle East, where farming villages dotted fertile plains, communities began clearing brush and leveling ground to link distant settlements. What had once been narrow footpaths widened enough for groups to travel side by side. Traders walking between villages could now carry larger loads, sometimes using simple sledges dragged over the earth. As networks grew, the distance a person could travel in a single day stretched farther than earlier generations imagined possible. This growing freedom encouraged the exchange of crops, livestock, and knowledge. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest signs of maintained routes appear near canals that farmers carved through the soil to guide water. Roads often followed these channels because they marked predictable lines across the landscape. A canal meant irrigation, and irrigation meant thriving farms. Travelers walking alongside could find food, shelter, and company at regular intervals. Over time, beaten tracks near these waterways hardened as thousands of bare feet and sandaled heels pressed them into shape. Archaeologists studying the region note that pottery fragments scattered along these routes match styles found hundreds of miles apart, proof that goods and stories traveled long distances. The growing effort to maintain roads hinted at something new: cooperation between communities. If a path washed out after a seasonal flood, neighbors gathered to rebuild it. A damaged crossing over marshy ground might be reinforced with branches, reeds, and stones. These small repairs mattered because they protected every household that relied on the route. Roads began to knit together not only villages, but the identities of people living along them. Strangers could become allies through trade. Farmers learned from one another, improving seeds and methods through shared experience. Bit by bit, these early networks set the stage for larger systems that would stretch far beyond the horizon. Trade soon reached distances that no single community controlled. Along the Persian Gulf and deeper into the Arabian Peninsula, caravans carried goods between farming centers and coastal villages. These journeys required steady routes across harsh ground. Travelers followed low ridges where winds cleared loose sand, or walked dried riverbeds that guided them for many miles. Over time, certain routes proved more reliable than others. People remembered where storms cut gullies, where wells never dried out, and where bandits might hide. Knowledge passed along these paths allowed ordinary families to travel safely between worlds that once seemed separated by emptiness. The need for dependable travel encouraged early engineering efforts. In places where soft ground threatened to swallow steps, travelers laid woven mats of reeds or stacked layers of brushwood to create a firm surface. Though simple, these solutions kept feet dry and allowed pack animals to carry more weight. Archaeologists have found traces of such surface strengthening near ancient oases, where caravans paused to rest and trade. These stops often grew into settlements because movement alone could sustain a community. Food, cloth, pottery, and ideas flowed through these crossroads long before writing preserved their names. Along these desert routes, stone markers sometimes signaled direction. A pile of rocks or an upright slab helped steer travelers during sandstorms or moonlit marches. Some markers may have held meaning beyond guidance, perhaps honoring ancestors or spirits tied to the land. Even without inscriptions, they show how seriously people treated the task of keeping travelers on course. Movement was now more than survival. It was opportunity. Roads carried salt, spices, and stories across boundaries that would later become nations. By the time metal tools entered regular use, many of these corridors were already ancient. The arrival of copper and bronze allowed workers to flatten bumps and cut through tougher soil, making travel steadier. Routes no longer shifted with every season. They hardened into lines recognizable today under modern roads and trails. Each step forward prepared the world for more ambitious networks that would cross mountains, deserts, and eventually oceans. As ancient people traveled farther, their routes began weaving entire regions together. In the Indus Valley, settlements such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro relied on carefully planned walkways within their grid-like city layouts. Outside their walls, long paths ran beside irrigation channels and along the edges of fields. Though not paved like later Roman roads, these routes were maintained carefully. Clay, gravel, and packed earth formed smooth surfaces that allowed carts and animals to move between towns without sinking into mud during monsoon seasons. Archaeologists studying these remnants note that standardized bricks and traded goods appear in cities hundreds of miles apart, signaling a coordinated network. The people of the Indus left no readable writing to explain their systems, but their roads reveal intention. Storage areas for grain, weights used to measure goods, and pottery styles spread across the region suggest that traffic flowed constantly along these corridors. Travelers may have carried cotton, beads, or metals toward distant workshops. Even ordinary goods such as grain and timber needed reliable paths. With each trip, the routes became more defined, linking communities through commerce rather than conquest. Farther east, early routes crisscrossed the Ganges Plain, connecting farming villages that later fed emerging kingdoms. Seasonal flooding often erased tracks, but the same paths reformed as people returned to familiar terrain. This repetition shaped the land as surely as any tool. Over generations, marsh paths hardened into raised causeways, supported by logs, reeds, and stones. These causeways are among the earliest examples of humans reshaping natural environments to protect movement through difficult areas. Travel along these Indian subcontinent routes also carried ideas about belief, settlement, and craft. As new techniques spread, pottery changed shape, crops improved, and communities grew larger. Roads served as channels for more than goods. They carried ways of thinking that would eventually influence religion, art, and government. Every mile walked reinforced the importance of connection, showing that paths were not just lines on soil, but lifelines between people who shared land, water, and knowledge. As movement expanded across South Asia, another network took shape across rugged mountains to the northwest. The early routes that later fed the Silk Road were first simple tracks worn by traders and herders navigating steep valleys in Central Asia. Long before silk or spices crossed continents, these pathways carried obsidian, salt, wool, and copper between small communities. The terrain demanded careful planning. Travelers hugged riverbanks where water and grass supported their animals, then climbed high passes during short summer seasons. Snow and ice blocked many routes for months at a time, forcing people to memorize every curve of the land so they could move quickly when the weather opened paths again. These journeys were slow and risky, but the rewards were great. Different regions offered unique goods, and no single community had everything it needed. Metal tools from one valley might reach another that produced hardy horses. Herbs used for medicine traveled farther still. By sharing resources, groups strengthened ties and reduced isolation. Archaeologists find proof of this exchange in pottery styles and tools scattered across wide distances, revealing that communities stayed connected even when politics or climate shifted. Over time, rest points emerged where travelers paused to feed animals, repair equipment, and trade. Some became seasonal markets where people from many valleys gathered. With more feet crossing the same ground, trails widened and became easier to follow. In a few locations, stones were arranged to stabilize slopes or guide travelers through rocky stretches. Though no master architect designed these roads, they improved through steady use and mutual care. These early networks set the stage for one of history's most famous trade systems. Many of the quiet footpaths carved by unknown herders would later form the skeleton of the Silk Road, linking worlds that once seemed impossibly distant. Long before caravans crossed from China toward the Mediterranean, the land already held the memories of countless smaller journeys, each shaping the path for the next. While Central Asia's mountain tracks grew busier, ancient Egypt built its own system of roads shaped by the Nile. For thousands of years, most travel in the region flowed along the river's current, with boats carrying goods between delta towns and Nubian settlements. Yet land routes were equally critical, especially where the river bent away from quarries, farms, and desert oases. Workers hauling limestone and granite from quarries at Aswan and other sites needed dependable paths to move heavy loads toward building projects far downstream. Archaeologists have discovered stretches of compacted dirt, sled paths, and stone-paved ramps created to support this movement. Some of these ancient haul roads are still visible in the desert today. They run straight across sand fields toward the river's edge, showing remarkable planning. Workers cleared stones, leveled slopes, and in some cases placed wooden tracks or poured water on the sand to reduce friction when dragging massive blocks. Evidence from inscriptions and workers' journals found near pyramid complexes indicates that organized labor forces traveled along these roads daily, carrying supplies, tools, and food for the crews. These routes were not only for monumental projects. Everyday exchange also flowed along them. Farmers walked their cattle toward village markets, and craftspeople carried pottery and cloth to trade with passing travelers. The desert roads linked the Nile Valley to far-off oases like Karga and Dakhla, turning isolated pockets into hubs of activity. Travelers relied on shaded rest stops dug into hillsides or on wells that offered rare water in the dry expanse. Egypt's blend of river and land routes shows how different environments shaped road systems. Where water served as a perfect highway, land-based roads supported excavation, agriculture, and administration. Together, they formed one of the world's earliest organized transport networks, maintained for centuries as rulers changed and kingdoms rose and fell. Movement became part of Egypt's identity, allowing ideas and people to reach places that would otherwise have remained separated by desert and distance. As travel networks strengthened in North Africa and Asia, similar systems emerged far to the west. Across the Mediterranean Sea, early European societies shaped landscapes with tracks that reflected their own needs and geography. In Bronze Age Greece, narrow stone-lined paths linked farmland to coastal towns where ships carried goods across the Aegean. The rocky terrain forced builders to work carefully, chiseling terraces along hillsides or stacking stones to support slopes. These roads were often little more than widened footpaths, but they made steady travel possible in lands where mountains blocked easy movement. One of the most impressive early networks appears on the island of Crete, home to the Minoan civilization. Archaeologists have uncovered paved routes made from carefully fitted stones that linked palaces, ports, and farming settlements. Some roads included drainage channels to keep water from pooling during storms. Their construction shows planning, labor coordination, and a clear understanding of long-distance needs. Goods such as pottery, olives, metal tools, and textiles moved along these routes, connecting communities across the island and beyond by sea. Farther north, across mainland Europe, people built timber causeways to cross wetlands and bogs. Logs laid side by side created stable platforms above soft ground. Many of these wooden tracks survived for thousands of years beneath waterlogged soil, preserved well enough for researchers to study tool marks left by builders. These causeways demonstrate how communities adapted to specific landscapes, crafting solutions that allowed travel where ordinary earth tracks would fail. Early European roads often lacked the scale or ambition of those in future empires, yet they shaped cultural exchange. Travelers carried stories, metalworking knowledge, and new crops between distant settlements. Over time, scattered communities slowly linked into larger networks, preparing the ground for expanding trade and shared technologies. With each passing generation, the idea of roads became more deliberate, reaching farther across valleys, forests, and mountain passes. The stage was set for civilizations that would change the meaning of road building entirely. The growing complexity of ancient roads became even more visible as emerging powers sought to control territory and manage trade. In the Near East, the Assyrian Empire built and maintained an organized system of long-distance routes that stretched across its expanding borders. Soldiers, messengers, and traders traveled along packed earth highways that linked fortresses, capitals, and far-flung settlements. These roads served a dual purpose. They strengthened the empire's military response and supported commerce between regions that produced different goods. Messages could move faster, and resources could be mobilized more easily. Archaeologists have uncovered stone milestones and way stations that mark these ancient corridors. Some were staffed with officials who watched traffic and collected records or taxes from passing caravans. Though only fragments survive today, they show how rulers understood the value of reliable travel. The empire depended on a functioning system to move grain, metals, fabrics, and livestock. Roads were not simply lines on a map. They were arteries that kept the state alive. Neighboring cultures soon followed similar patterns. The Babylonian and Persian regions expanded earlier networks, linking roads to canals and river crossings. The Persians in particular managed a remarkable system known as the Royal Road, which allowed messengers to travel with speed unmatched for centuries. Relays of horses and riders ensured that information moved quickly across hundreds of miles. The famous saying recorded by Greek historians, describing couriers traveling in all weather, reflects how impressive this network once was. These road systems show how expanding political power encouraged structural improvements. Travelers needed protection from bandits, shelter from heat and storms, and access to water along the way. Empires took responsibility for solving these problems. By maintaining roads, they maintained stability. Even when kingdoms shifted and capitals fell, the pathways remained. Later, peoples adopted and reused them, demonstrating that once a road exists, it rarely disappears entirely. It becomes part of the land's memory and part of the shared story of movement. The Persian Royal Road stands as one of the earliest large-scale engineered routes in history. Stretching from Susa near the Persian Gulf to Sardis near the Aegean Sea, It crossed mountains, plains, and river valleys. What makes this road especially remarkable is not only its length, but the support system that accompanied it. Relay stations offered shelter, food, and fresh animals so that messages and goods could move with unusual speed. Historians note that dispatches once traveled the entire length of the road in just a few days when carried by trained couriers. For ordinary travelers, the journey took longer, but the road promised safety and direction. Construction along this route varied by location. In some regions, packed earth formed the base. In others, stone slabs stiffened the surface. Bridges spanned rivers that once forced travelers to detour or wait for low water. With each improvement, the route became more dependable. Traders used it to move textiles, metalwork, and spices. Craftsmen learned new techniques, and soldiers marched to defend or expand the empire's frontiers. The Royal Road also linked to smaller branches that reached into distant valleys and coastal settlements. These side routes carried people from isolated areas toward major cities, allowing rural communities to share in the prosperity of long-distance trade. Even after the Persian Empire declined, the road survived, adopted first by conquerors and later by merchants. Some sections evolved into Roman routes or medieval caravan paths. This road highlights a shift in how societies viewed movement. Travel was no longer a challenge each group solved alone. Instead, road building became a public investment that supported everyone under the empire's influence. The Persian model inspired future civilizations by proving that organized infrastructure created unity, opportunity, and shared identity across vast distances. As the Persian system influenced the region, another powerful tradition began rising on the western shores of the Mediterranean. The early Romans inherited a patchwork of trails from older Italian peoples, including the Etruscans and Latin tribes. At first, these paths served local farming communities, linking hilltop settlements to river crossings and markets. But as Rome expanded from a small city along the Tiber River into a rising power, its leaders realized that roads were essential for control. What began as local tracks slowly transformed into one of the most famous transportation networks in human history. Early Roman engineers improved routes with layers of gravel, clay, and stone. Over time, they perfected a method that produced remarkably durable roads. Workers dug trenches, laid drainage ditches to prevent flooding, and topped surfaces with stones fitted so tightly that some segments remain usable today. These roads stretched far beyond the city, connecting conquered lands and allowing armies to march quickly across the countryside. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," reflects how completely the network centered on the capital. Yet military needs were only part of the story. Merchants hauled olive oil, wine, grain, and crafts along the new highways. Travelers on foot walked beside carts pulled by oxen or horses. Inns, markets, and repair stations developed along the busiest stretches, bringing prosperity to people who lived far from Rome itself. Information also flowed more quickly. News of war, new laws, or distant events could spread across the empire's vast territories. The Roman network represented a shift toward roads as long-term infrastructure rather than temporary solutions. Once paved, they endured generations of use. Although Rome's empire eventually fractured, the roads continued serving new rulers and new communities. Many modern European highways follow their old lines, showing how deep an impact ancient builders left. These early Roman paths demonstrate how a civilization's vision for unity and mobility could shape entire continents long after its power faded. As Roman engineering matured, the scale of construction reached astonishing levels. Roads stretched across mountains, deserts, and marshes, places where most earlier societies had avoided building at all. One remarkable example lies in the Alps, where Roman workers carved switchbacks and supported terraces to carry stone highways through steep passes. These routes allowed troops and goods to cross barriers that once isolated regions. The Alps no longer stood as an unbreakable wall. Instead, they became a gateway linking northern Europe with Mediterranean centers. Roman roads also supported communication, an advantage as important as military mobility. A network of couriers delivered information along marked distances between cities. Milestones engraved with distances and road names still appear across Europe, offering proof of how thoroughly the system was organized. Messages carried on these routes informed governors, settled disputes, and coordinated massive logistics such as grain distribution or troop movements. Without such roads, the empire could not have maintained its reach. Roads influenced settlement too. New towns sprang up at key junctions where travelers crossed paths, and older villages expanded when they found themselves along important arteries. Markets flourished at crossroads, and craftsmen produced tools, clothing, and food for constant streams of travelers. Movement reinforced prosperity. In some cases, entire regions survived difficult years because roads connected them to aid or trade when crops failed locally. Perhaps most striking is how long the Roman routes endured. Even after centuries of wear, segments remain visible or buried beneath modern asphalt. Archaeologists uncover stones worn smooth by wheels long vanished. Maps comparing ancient itineraries with modern highways show familiar lines connecting major cities. This continuity demonstrates the deep mark Rome left on the physical shape of Europe. The empire's lasting legacy lies not only in law or language, but in the very ground beneath modern travelers' feet, where roads forge continuity across time. While Rome pushed west and north, other societies built equally impressive systems far from the Mediterranean. In China, the foundations of long-distance roads formed during early dynasties, connecting river valleys, farms, and administrative centers. As kingdoms unified under larger governments, especially during the Qin and Han periods, road building accelerated. These dynasties recognized that control of territory required reliable travel, just as Persia and Rome had learned. Officials and soldiers could not govern scattered settlements without safe routes binding them together. Chinese workers laid packed earth roads across plains and through forested hillsides. In some regions, layers of gravel and stone provided added strength. Bridges spanned rivers, some made from timber and others from carefully shaped stone blocks. These routes supported tax collection, troop movements, and trade of silk, salt, grain, and iron. Perhaps most importantly, they connected northern and southern regions along corridors that encouraged the blending of cultures and ideas. Farmers from distant places learned new planting methods, while craftsmen exchanged techniques in metal and pottery work. As the Silk Road expanded, Chinese routes linked with networks in Central Asia. Goods and travelers moved across wide distances, passing through desert towns and mountain passes. Caravans carried silk, spices, and glass, creating lines of exchange that shaped economies far beyond China. These journeys also carried knowledge, from mathematics and astronomy to religious beliefs that slowly spread between civilizations. Road maintenance was a responsibility shared between the state and local communities. Records describe teams clearing debris after storms or rebuilding embankments cut by floods. Even when dynasties fell and new powers rose, many of the same routes continued serving the people. The land remembered the paths, allowing them to shift rather than vanish. China's early roads demonstrate how geography, government, and culture intertwine. They show that the desire to move, trade, and learn is not limited to one region. Across continents, roads evolved whenever societies recognized that connection was essential to survival and growth. To the south of China, ancient Southeast Asia developed networks shaped by rivers, floodplains, and dense forests. In early kingdoms, such as Funan and later Khmer states, land and water routes merged into complex systems. Archaeologists studying the Mekong Delta have uncovered raised embankments and causeways running through marshy ground. These structures linked settlements, temples, and trading hubs long before the rise of Angkor. Their builders used laterite blocks, sand, and compacted clay, demonstrating an understanding of engineering suited to monsoon climates. As the Khmer Empire grew, especially between the 9th and 13th centuries, the scale of road building expanded dramatically. Long, straight causeways stretched between major cities and outlying regions. Stone bridges crossed rivers and canals, supported by arches decorated with carved balustrades. Reliefs at temple complexes portray people hauling goods along these routes, showing how movement shaped daily life. Travelers carried rice, fish, salt, and woven goods from rural villages toward bustling urban centers. In return, religious and administrative power radiated outward along the same paths. Water routes often worked together with roads. Great reservoirs known as barays collected and channeled seasonal rain, feeding irrigation networks that sustained agriculture. Canals doubled as transport corridors, allowing goods to move even during heavy rains. The careful integration of land and water shows how deeply Khmer planners understood their environment. Roads could shift when necessary, but waterways required maintenance and cooperation across generations. Trade flowed across cultural borders as well. Maritime merchants from India, China, and island Southeast Asia brought textiles, ceramics, beads, and religious teachings that later shaped art and architecture. Roads extended these influences inland, connecting coastal markets to inland capitals. Even after the Khmer Empire declined, many of its routes remained as village paths, farm roads, or modern highways. The enduring traces show how movement bound people together in one of the world's most advanced pre-modern landscapes. Across the Indian Ocean, another network quietly shaped civilizations along Africa's east coast. Long before written history described them, communities on the Swahili coast traveled between sheltered bays, estuaries, and inland villages. Paths followed riverbanks and coastal ridges, linking fishing towns with farming regions where millet, sorghum, and fruit could be grown. Trade with inland groups brought iron, ivory, and animal skins toward the coast, while imported goods flowed in the opposite direction. Though many of these early routes were simple earth tracks, they formed the backbone of a growing commercial world. As maritime trade expanded during the first millennium CE, coastal settlements such as Kilwa, Mombasa, and Mogadishu flourished. Indian Ocean traders from Arabia, Persia, and India brought cloth, beads, ceramics, and spices. These items moved inland through networks of paths that wound into the savannas and forests. Caravans guided by experienced trackers carried loads balanced on people's backs or on pack animals. Tropical landscapes shifted seasonally, so travelers relied on local knowledge about safe crossings, water holes, and shelter from storms. Archaeologists investigating these routes uncover fragments that mirror goods found across the sea. Chinese porcelain shards appear far from the coast, marking where trade reached villages that had never seen a ship. Iron tools crafted inland reappear in coastal markets, evidence of mutual exchange shaping both sides. These hidden paths also carried language and culture, helping form the Swahili identity, which blended African roots with influences from Arabia and the wider Indian Ocean world. Although no vast stone highways ran through this region, the network's impact was enormous. It linked farming, herding, and fishing communities and allowed cities to thrive on commerce rather than conquest. Many modern roads in East Africa trace these older paths, weaving through landscapes shaped by centuries of steady movement. The Swahili story shows that the power of roads lies not only in engineering, but in the human connections they sustain. While coastal East Africa developed along maritime trade lines, West Africa built road networks sustained by inland empires. One of the earliest large civilizations in this region, the Kingdom of Ghana, relied on land routes that crossed the Sahel, a broad band of grassland south of the Sahara. These paths linked agricultural villages to mining areas where gold dust, salt, and iron were extracted. Traders used camels and donkeys to carry loads across long distances marked by sparse vegetation and shifting sand. Knowledge of wells and seasonal water sources was essential. Families passed route information from generation to generation, turning survival skills into shared geography. As Ghana declined, the Mali Empire rose and expanded these networks. The famous city of Timbuktu emerged as a major stop along trans-Saharan routes. Caravans stretched for miles, carrying salt from northern desert mines southward and returning with gold, kola nuts, and textiles. Roads here were not paved, but they were carefully maintained through experience and cooperation. Travelers identified safe campsites, recognized wind-shaped dunes as guides, and relied on expert guides who read stars and sand patterns like maps. The Niger River system also shaped West African travel networks. Boats carried people during flood seasons, and when waters retreated, land routes along the banks offered different pathways. Communities developed marketplaces along these changing corridors. Goods and ideas flowed between grasslands, forests, and desert edges, bringing together diverse cultures, languages, and religions. The arrival of Islam further strengthened these land networks. Mosques, schools, and scholarly communities appeared at key crossroads, turning trade routes into channels of learning and faith. Timbuktu became renowned not only for commerce, but for libraries that preserved knowledge. These highways of sand and grass prove that roads do not need stone to transform societies. Their value lay in linking remote environments, allowing empires to flourish where geography alone might have isolated people. Far across the ocean, the Americas held their own remarkable systems long before European arrival. One of the most sophisticated networks belonged to the Andean world. The people who eventually formed the Inca Empire inherited a landscape of towering peaks, deep valleys, and dramatic coastal deserts. Rather than avoiding these challenges, they built routes that rose and fell with the land itself. Early highland cultures developed footpaths linking farming terraces, herding grounds, and trade centers. Llamas carried loads along narrow trails carved into mountainsides. When the Inca expanded, these earlier paths became part of a vast and organized network known today as the Capacñan. It stretched for thousands of miles, connecting Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Builders crafted stairways from stone and packed earth roads across plains. In steep terrain, retaining walls supported routes clinging to cliffs. Suspension bridges made from woven plant fibers crossed deep gorges. These bridges required constant renewal and community labor, showing how society relied on collective maintenance to keep the network alive. The system served more than travel. Way stations called tambo housed messengers, stored food, and sheltered armies. Runners known as chasqui relayed messages between stations, passing information with remarkable speed. Goods from distant regions, coca leaves, dried fish, textiles, crops, moved to administrative centers where they could be redistributed. The Inca network also linked diverse cultures living in vastly different environments, from coastal fishers to high-altitude farmers. Roads enabled the empire to gather labor, share resources, and manage local needs. Though the system weakened after Spanish conquest, many routes remain visible or still used by Andean communities today. The Capacñan stands as one of history's greatest examples of engineering without wheels or iron tools, shaped entirely by human ingenuity and cooperation. While the Andes showcased mountain engineering, another impressive system developed in the dense forests and lowlands of Mesoamerica. The Maya world extended across present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Cities rose from jungle clearings, and networks of stone-paved roads known as sacbeab, singular sacbe, linked them together. These elevated white roads cut through marshes and thick vegetation, providing firm surfaces that remain visible even in wet seasons. Some sacbeabs stretch dozens of miles. One famous causeway connects the cities of Coba and Yaxuna, running straight across challenging terrain. Archaeologists believe it served trade, communication, and ceremonial purposes. The roads were often coated with bright limestone plaster that reflected sunlight, making travel easier at night and symbolizing sacred meaning. Travelers moved along these routes carrying salt, obsidian, cacao, textiles, and jade. Markets at crossroads allowed small communities to benefit from regional exchange. Sacbeab construction required careful planning. Builders leveled ground, laid packed earth, and placed stone retaining walls. In swampy areas, fill was brought in to elevate the path. Unlike Roman roads, they were not always designed for massive cargo, but for foot traffic supported by human porters. Their presence reveals how movements shaped political and cultural landscapes. City-states gained influence not only through warfare, but by becoming centers connected through reliable transit. Beyond commerce, roads served spiritual needs. Many sacbeab led to temples or plazas where religious ceremonies took place. Processions likely moved along these routes during festivals. The roads symbolized unity between settlements and between people and their deities. Even after the Maya kingdoms declined, sacbeab remained, hidden beneath jungle cover until modern archaeology uncovered them. Their legacy reminds us that ancient road building came in many forms. Stone highways, canals, and dirt paths all fulfilled the same purpose, linking people, ideas, and goods across landscapes that might otherwise keep them apart. North America also held vast travel networks long before paved streets or wagons appeared. Many indigenous societies developed sophisticated trail systems that followed river valleys, crossed forests, and linked distant regions from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. These paths supported trade in copper, mica, shells, pottery, and food. Archaeologists tracing artifact origins have found copper from northern mines as far south as Florida, revealing how widely goods and ideas traveled. People could cross entire regions by following familiar landmarks and trusted guides who understood the terrain through seasons and storms. Along the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the mound-building cultures created centers that required steady movement. Places such as Cahokia thrived partly because paths linked outlying farming villages to the city. Workers, traders, and visiting communities traveled along packed earth trails that radiated outward like spokes. These routes made it possible to bring surplus crops, timber, and clay into markets and ceremonial plazas. The flow of people also allowed stories, music, and rituals to spread between groups that lived miles apart. Some trails developed into long-distance highways that later became known as the Natchez Trace, the Great Indian Warpath, and the Chickasaw Trail. These routes connected the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Travelers followed ridgelines when possible, avoiding marshes and protecting themselves from seasonal floods. Where rivers ran parallel to the trails, travelers could shift between land and water depending on weather and need. These networks influenced the environment as well. Camps and villages formed at river crossings, fertile flats, and sheltered hills. Over generations, these stops grew into gathering places where diplomacy, trade, and knowledge-sharing took place. Even without stone markers or written maps, the trails held shared meaning and memory. People knew which paths led to safe ground, which wound through hunting territory, and which crossed into neighboring nations. Many elements of these ancient roadways survive today as modern highways, forest roads, and pilgrimage routes that still follow the same geography shaped by thousands of years of footsteps. Another remarkable network lay hidden beneath the rainforests of the Amazon. For centuries, outsiders assumed the region was too wet and wild to support large populations or structured transportation. However, modern archaeology has overturned this belief. Through aerial surveys, satellite imagery, and later scanning, scientists have uncovered long, straight earthworks that run for miles across what was once thought to be untouched jungle. These ancient roads connected settlements, ceremonial centers, and agricultural fields maintained by indigenous societies long before European arrival. Many of these pathways are raised slightly above the surrounding ground, helping travelers stay above seasonal flooding. Some form grids that intersect with canals, suggesting an organized system of water and land transport. Alongside them, researchers find remnants of villages, plazas, and geometric earthworks, circles, squares, and ditches that mark the presence of once thriving communities. These findings show that thousands of people lived, farmed, and traveled in landscapes previously underestimated by historians. The Amazonian road systems required coordinated labor. Clearing vegetation, leveling soil, and maintaining embankments demanded constant work. Communities likely shared these responsibilities, improving the land over generations. Charcoal deposits, pottery fragments, and crop remains reveal long-term habitation, with foods such as maize, manioc, and fruit sustaining large populations. Trade goods like stone and shells found far from their sources indicate extensive exchange networks. These newly revealed roads challenge older assumptions about Amazon cultures. Rather than isolated groups surviving in harsh conditions, many societies actively shape the environment to support dense populations and regional movement. Though forests reclaim the land after disease and disruption following colonization, traces of these ancient networks remain beneath the canopy. Modern technology now uncovers the memories hidden in soil, revealing civilizations that moved confidently across terrain once assumed impassable. Movement shaped indigenous Australia as well, though the continent lacked paved highways or monumental construction. Instead, Aboriginal peoples developed vast overland travel routes known broadly as songlines or dreaming tracks. These paths crossed deserts, mountains, and coastlines, linking waterholes, campsites, and ceremonial places. Unlike stone roads, songlines were mapped through oral tradition. Knowledge of direction, resources, and spiritual meaning was embedded in stories, songs, and rituals that guided travelers across immense distances. Each segment of a songline held layers of information. A verse might describe a rock formation that marked a safe passage, a water source beyond a dune, or a boundary between groups. By singing the correct sequence, travelers could navigate accurately even without visible markers. These routes enabled trade in ochre, food, tools, and shells across the continent. Archaeologists have traced artifacts like pearl shells traded from coastal regions deep into the interior, proving the full reach of these networks. While the land may appear empty to an outsider, to those familiar with it, the country was filled with signposts. Footpaths formed naturally from repeated journeys and often followed animal tracks or seasonal water flow. Over time, routes settled into predictable lines. Many modern highways and stock routes follow the same corridors established thousands of years ago through song and shared cultural knowledge. Song lines also carried beliefs, connecting communities through shared ancestry and spirituality. Movement along them reinforced cultural identity and responsibility for the land. Travelers were expected to care for sites and respect the traditions tied to each place. This form of navigation shows that roads are not only physical structures, they can be systems of memory, knowledge, and cooperation. Australia's ancient travel network highlights a different perspective on roads. It proves that connection does not require stone or metal. Human intention, observation, and communication can create pathways just as enduring as any built highway, etched not only into ground, but into culture itself. Across the Pacific, many island societies built their own networks adapted to the rhythms of ocean and land. In Polynesia and Micronesia, people traveled between islands using expert navigation based on stars, wind patterns, and currents. Once ashore, communities created footpaths that linked villages, farming plots, and ceremonial sites. On some islands, archaeologists have uncovered paved sections built from coral blocks or basalt slabs, laid carefully to withstand rain and erosion. These roads reveal how island populations manage movement even in limited space. One striking example lies in Nan Madol, a ceremonial complex in present-day Micronesia. Built on artificial islets connected by canals and walkways, the site required coordinated labor and carefully constructed routes. People moved across tidal flats on stone causeways that allowed access regardless of water level. Goods and offerings flowed into central spaces where rituals and leadership gatherings took place. The interconnected channels and paths show how land and sea routes work together, forming a unique transportation system shaped by landscape and belief. In Polynesia, routes often followed ridges rather than valleys, avoiding dense vegetation and allowing travelers to see landmarks across long distances. Trails linked farms producing taro, sweet potatoes, and breadfruit with coastal settlements where canoes arrived from neighboring islands. Artifacts moved along these paths, including tools, pottery, and prized feathers. Oral histories preserve memories of journeys that crossed both water and land, reflecting a deep understanding of terrain and navigation. Island networks highlight the importance of flexibility. Roads could shift after storms, volcanic eruptions, or changes in settlement patterns. Instead of rigid engineering, communities adapted paths to meet new needs. Some trails remained essential for centuries, while others faded into forest. Today, many island routes survive as hiking trails or village footpaths, reminders of societies that flourished through connection rather than isolation. These Pacific systems demonstrate that roads can take many forms, from stone causeways to coral paving to sand tracks, and that every environment inspires solutions suited to its demands. Back in Eurasia, the Silk Road gradually transformed from scattered mountain paths into a sprawling network reaching across continents. It was never a single road, but a constellation of routes stretching thousands of miles from China through Central Asia and into the Middle East and Mediterranean. Travelers moved goods step by step, passing through oasis towns, mountain passes, and desert valleys. Each region hosted its own traders, often specializing in particular products. Silk, spices, glass, metals, and precious stones changed hands repeatedly, gaining value as they crossed borders. Caravans depended on predictable waypoints. Oasis towns such as Samarkand, Kashgar, and Merv became centers of culture and exchange. Archaeologists uncover ruins of storehouses, shrines, workshops, and market halls that once served passing merchants. These stops offered water and shelter, but also information. Travelers learned about distant weather patterns, political tensions, or new opportunities. Knowledge moved alongside cargo, shaping decisions and creating ties between cultures that never physically met. The movement of religion and ideas may be the Silk Road's greatest legacy. Buddhism traveled from India into China, then spread across East Asia. Art styles blended, showing motifs borrowed from Persia, Greece, and India. Techniques in science, medicine, and mathematics also dispersed along these routes. Without the web of roads and trails that formed the Silk Road, such exchanges would have been slower or impossible. Yet the route was not always safe. Sandstorms, harsh winters, and bandits threatened travelers. Empires rose and fell, shifting the stability of the region. Some branches prospered for centuries before political changes forced merchants onto new paths. Roads are dynamic, shaped as much by human ambition as by landscape. Even after sea routes eclipsed overland trade, the Silk Road continued serving local needs. Today, modern highways, railways, and fiber optic lines often follow the same corridors, proving that movement leaves a lasting impression on geography. While the Silk Road flourished across land, other societies mastered travel along water-based highways that linked inland regions as effectively as paved routes. In ancient North America, the Mississippian and Hopewell cultures developed extensive river networks, using canoes to navigate thousands of miles of waterways. Rivers such as the Ohio, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee acted as natural corridors. From these watery highways, trails extended inland, forming combined land and water systems. Goods like copper, obsidian, shells, pipes, and carved stone were exchanged between regions separated by mountains and forests. These routes required knowledge of seasonal changes. High spring waters allowed faster travel, while low summer flows exposed sandbars and forced paddlers to carry canoes over land. Communities became experts at reading currents, understanding where eddies slowed or where rapids formed natural obstacles. River crossings marked meeting points where travelers paused to trade, rest, or attend ceremonial gatherings. Archaeologists find evidence of shared symbols and styles across wide geographic ranges, showing how cultural influence moved alongside material goods. Similar water systems connected societies across the Amazon and Orinoco basins of South America. Canoes carried families, traders, and warriors across flooded forests that shifted appearance each season. Long before European contact, these networks supported complex societies whose roads floated rather than rested on soil. When water levels dropped, land trails filled the gaps, showing how flexible travel systems could adapt to constantly changing environments. Water routes shaped settlement patterns. Villages often formed along river bends, where fishing was abundant and safe landing sites existed. Larger ceremonial centers rose at strategic junctions where multiple waterways converge. As trade expanded, communities specialized. Some produced food, others crafted metal or pottery, and still others offered services to passing travelers. This diversity depended entirely on mobility. These watery roads remind us that not every ancient network was carved from earth or stone. Rivers served as highways, shaping societies and binding distant peoples together through shared movement and exchange. As human societies continued to grow, roads began shaping not only travel and trade, but identity and territory. In many regions, a well-used path marked more than convenience. It became a boundary line, a shared responsibility, or a source of pride. Along the Mediterranean during classical times, villages adopted nearby stretches of highway, clearing debris, repairing surfaces, and providing hospitality for travelers. In return, these communities benefited from the steady flow of people who spent money, shared knowledge, and sometimes settled permanently. The road brought opportunity just as surely as rain or fertile soil. In places without strong, centralized rule, local groups took charge of maintaining the trails their livelihoods depended on. Farmers widened tracks leading to markets, while herders cut brush from grazing routes. In mountainous regions across Europe and Asia, seasonal paths turned into permanent links as travelers improved them little by little. Switchbacks lengthened to soften steep slopes, and stone steps appeared where footing was especially treacherous. The work was incremental, but over centuries it reshaped whole landscapes. Roads also encouraged specialization. When people had reliable access to distant markets, they began producing more than they needed. Craftsmen concentrated on pottery, metalwork, textiles, or tools, confident that someone would transport their surplus. Farmers could grow crops suited to local soils and trade them for goods from far away. This growing interdependence helped form long-distance economic webs long before modern technology. Religious pilgrimage helped bind road systems together in yet another way. Shrines, temples, and sacred springs drew visitors from hundreds of miles. The desire to reach these places gave routes symbolic power beyond their practical use. Travelers shared food, stories, and prayers along the way, strengthening cultural identity across regions that did not always share language or politics. Long before roads served empires, they served belief. These developments reveal how roads evolved from simple necessity into cultural infrastructure. Travel shaped how people saw their world and their place within it, no longer isolated, but connected by threads of earth and memory. As the ancient world moved toward the Middle Ages, the purpose of long-distance routes continued to shift. With the fall of empires, many grand highways lost centralized support. Stones broke loose, bridges sank into marshes, and mile markers disappeared beneath soil. Yet the paths themselves rarely vanished. Farmers still followed the same curves, pilgrims still walked the same hillsides, and merchants continued to trace familiar valleys. Roads outlasted the governments that built them because they were woven into daily life. In Europe, Roman roads often became survival corridors. Monasteries and small towns rose along their edges, providing shelter, food, and guidance to travelers. Some roads narrowed into trails used mainly on foot or horseback, while others continued serving carts and caravans. These routes helped knit the patchwork of emerging kingdoms into something resembling shared space. The very act of travel preserved cultural awareness during a time when many institutions fractured. Monks copied manuscripts from distant regions, traders brought goods and news from hundreds of miles away, and diplomats crossed borders once guarded by imperial soldiers. Elsewhere, older systems found new guardians. In the Middle East and Central Asia, shifting dynasties inherited and repaired segments of ancient routes. Caravans still crossed deserts and plains, moving goods between rich cities. Inns and shelters, known as caravanserais, offered secure lodging and storage. These fortified rest stops turned dangerous journeys into manageable segments. A traveler might spend weeks crossing terrain, but each night could bring a warm roof and company from faraway lands. This infrastructure helped sustain trade even when political unity faded. In Africa, America, and Asia, pre-existing networks adapted to new patterns. Some grew quieter as populations shifted, while others gained importance as trade partners changed. The constant thread across continents was motion. Routes did not need imperial architects to survive, they just needed footsteps. As long as people continued walking, seeking food, markets, or meaning, the roads endured, shaping history long after their designers were forgotten. As time moved forward, roads became channels for more than trade and politics. They carried culture from one community to another. Travelers brought stories filled with wonder, fear, humor, and hope. A tale heard beside a fire in one village might be repeated hundreds of miles away months later. Songs changed slightly from place to place, gaining local melodies while keeping their original meaning. Words and phrases blended into new languages. In this way, roads shaped the identities of entire regions without leaving a single written mark. Markets along these roads turned into melting pots. Farmers might meet traveling musicians, wandering healers, or merchants carrying goods nobody had seen before. Sometimes knowledge arrived quietly, hidden in a tool or farming trick. A new way to plant seeds could spread faster along a trusted road than through conquest. Other times, movement brought challenges. Illness could travel just as easily as ideas, reminding people that connection offered both opportunity and risk. Some societies responded by building checkpoints or quarantines, early examples of managing the flow of travelers. Yet despite hardship, roads remained symbols of possibility. People followed them to seek better harvests, escape droughts, or rebuild after conflict. Refugees and migrants walked the same lines once used by armies or merchants. When climate changed and lands dried, roads guided families toward rivers or coastlines. When new rulers rose, they used old paths to reach towns they hoped to govern. Scholars note that ancient roads reveal how people believed in the future. Nobody packs soil or lays stones unless they expect others to follow. Every repaired bridge and cleared path speaks of optimism and continuity. Even the smallest trail through a field hinted at tomorrow, at meetings yet to occur, at children who might use it long after the builders were gone. By the dawn of more recent eras, many old routes remained essential. They formed the hidden skeleton beneath growing nations. Where roads converged, towns expanded into cities. Where they faded, communities often vanished. The world humans inherited was already shaped by countless footsteps stretching across thousands of years. Even as societies adopted new technologies, the influence of ancient roots continued. The introduction of wheeled carts, horses with saddles, and eventually iron tools did not erase older pathways. Instead, innovations sharpened their purpose. Roads widened to accommodate carts and wagons. Surfaces hardened with gravel or stone in areas where rainfall turned tracks into mud. Bridge building advanced, allowing travelers to cross rivers and ravines that once forced long detours. As these changes spread, distances shrank in practical terms. Journeys that once required weeks could be completed in days. Many ancient corridors found new life as trade shifted from local exchange to wider systems. Navigators from the Indian Ocean sailed across larger distances, forming maritime routes that fed inland roads. In Europe and Asia, new empires rebuilt or extended earlier highways, often following the same alignments chosen centuries before. The logic of landscape, where water flowed, where food grew, where terrain eased movement, remained constant. The oldest paths had already mapped these truths. Archaeologists studying these transitions notice a continuity that ties eras together. Roman planners traced older Etruscan and Greek trails. Medieval traders walked Roman milestones. Early Islamic caravans crossed Persian marks. Indigenous roads beneath parts of the Americas guided Spanish expansion, not because colonizers understood their history, but because the routes simply worked. Old knowledge lingered beneath new boots and hooves. These overlapping layers show how infrastructure evolves gradually rather than appearing fully formed. No single person or kingdom built a system all at once. Instead, roads expanded like living branches. A small trail became a community link. A community link grew into a regional spine. A spine tied into networks spanning continents. Each generation added its own improvements, as if participating in a relay that passed knowledge rather than a baton. By the time iron reshaped agriculture and trade, the world already contained tens of thousands of miles of established pathways. Many began so quietly that no one recorded their origins. Yet they paved the way, literally and figuratively, for the systems that would soon dominate global movement. As history approached the edge of what we consider the modern era, ancient roads continued guiding the spread of people, goods, and ideas. Cities positioned along old corridors flourished into commercial hubs, while regions away from major routes often remained rural or isolated. Maps began reflecting these patterns, but long before anyone drew a line, people already knew which valleys led forward and which trails vanished into wilderness. Geography shaped lives, and roads translated geography into movement. Innovation appeared in many forms. In parts of Asia and the Middle East, engineers experimented with surface treatments, mixing lime, gravel, and sand to make harder foundations. Timber plank roads allowed carts to roll through swamps and marshes that previously stopped traffic. In mountainous zones, workers widened passes to fit pack animals carrying iron, timber, or cloth. One small repair could influence hundreds of journeys that followed, proving how even minor changes had long echoes. Communication also transformed. Messengers, once walking dirt paths alone, now traveled in organized relays along fortified routes. Governments recognized that roads carried authority just as much as armies did. When rulers sent orders or collected taxes, the roads became instruments of administration. When scholars traveled to catalog knowledge in distant monasteries or courts, the same paths linked intellectual traditions across regions. Yet older wisdom still mattered. Travelers relied on local knowledge to navigate weather, read signs in soil, or avoid risky crossings. Guides who knew when rivers rose and fell remained essential. Communities living along the roads became caretakers of travel culture, offering food, shelter, and information. These exchanges created bonds that endured even when borders shifted or empires redrew political maps. By this stage, the world held countless hidden strands of movement: rutted tracks, stone-paved highways, foot-worn forest paths, and river corridors braided into living networks. Although technologies changed and new tools appeared, the basic truth remained: people needed ways to reach each other. Roads met that need, and in doing so shaped societies with a quiet persistence far stronger than any wall or fortress. As the world entered the early modern period, many ancient roadways blended into newer systems without disappearing. Stone highways, earth tracks, and river corridors remained vital, even as societies experimented with new forms of transport. Caravans still crossed deserts, runners carried messages, and farmers traveled to weekly markets using the same routes their ancestors walked. Yet change was underway. Technologies such as metal-shod wheels, improved saddles, and stronger pack animals increased the load people could move. Roads already in place could suddenly support heavier traffic, linking distant regions more tightly than ever. In some areas, regular maintenance became a shared responsibility enforced by law. Towns assigned labor to repair bridges or fill ruts after storms. Travelers paid tolls that funded clearing fallen trees and reinforcing embankments. These policies reflected a growing understanding that movement supported entire economies. A blocked road could break trade networks, while an improved one could transform a town into a thriving center. Meanwhile, the age of exploration reshaped global movement. Ships reached new continents, and maritime routes brought distant worlds into contact. Yet even then, once travelers landed, they followed existing indigenous footpaths. In Asia, Africa, and the Americas, European explorers and settlers relied on local guides and native trails to navigate landscapes they could not read alone. Their journals describe walking along roads worn deep by generations, proof that old systems supported new ages. These roads also carried consequences. Along with trade, they spread diseases and conflict, yet they continued to carry resistance, creativity, and resilience as well. Communities use the same corridors to migrate away from war or environmental change, to carry traditions into new places, and to rebuild after hardship. Ancient routes flexed and adapted to conditions their builders could never have imagined. By the close of this period, roads had become threads linking continents, cultures, and peoples. Long before railways, highways, and engines, the world's movement rested on networks carved by countless footsteps, hooves, and hands. Their legacy lies not only in distance traveled, but in the shared human story they carry beneath every mile.